Thanksgiving dinner made you go no contact with family. I was helping my 20-year-old brother wipe his butt when he started to cry. You see, he has autism, and I'd been his carer since I was 9. When I was done, we shuffled to the living room for Thanksgiving dinner, where Mom immediately started to boast to her boyfriend. Ah, here comes my autistic son Pack. I've sacrificed so much of my life for you. All the lost friendships, expenses, sleepless nights, but it's all worth it to have my special little boy. Isn't that right, Pack? She was staring directly at her boyfriend, a special ed teacher. That's when he asked something innocent. What level is Pack's autism? Has he been reassessed recently? Mom's smile got tighter. Oh, he's very, very severe. Show Derek how you eat, baby. Pack dropped his fork. F this. I'm done pretending to be R-worded for you, Mom. The room froze. Mom's glass stopped halfway to her mouth. Pack's having an episode? No, his voice was different. I'm done pretending. Done with the diapers you make me wear. Derek leaned forward. Pack, are you saying you're neurotypical? Mom said if I didn't act like an R-word, she'd find a way to have me institutionalized and throw away the key. His voice cracked. Maddie, I'm so sorry. Sorry for what? My voice was barely a whisper. The whole thing was an act. You had straight A's until sophomore year. You were supposed to be valedictorian. The room was spinning. My MIT scholarship. Pack went white. You got into MIT? Full ride. Mom said I had to decline because you needed me. His voice was barely a squeak. She showed me the letters before she burned them. Why would she do that? My voice was breaking. Mom tried to leave, but Derek blocked the doorway. Pat kept going, pulling up something on his phone. The GoFundMe. Help Maddie care for her severely disabled brother. $127,000 raised. I couldn't breathe. $127K. All while I was eating expired food from the diner where I worked. Where did the money go, Mom? She didn't respond, so I grabbed her phone and held it up to her face to unlock it. The transaction history loaded. I wanted to tear my hair out. You spent over $100,000 in the casino. You gambled away our entire future on slot machines. Mom tried to grab the phone, but Derek held her back. I didn't mean for it to get this far. I wanted to earn it back. Is this why my boyfriend broke up with me right after you had dinner together? The words just came out. Pack looked confused, but Mom's face went white. He sent letters, Pack said quietly. Dozens. I found the ashes in her jewelry box. David and I had a baby, I whispered. Pack froze. What baby? I miscarried right after we broke up. Mom said it was because of the stress of caring for you. Pack was walking towards at the medicine cabinet, and he came back holding a pill bottle that read, Mifepristone, abortion medication. Mom told me this was for her. Mom finally spoke. A baby would have ruined everything. I steadied myself on the counter and took a hit of my vape, not even caring that we were inside. Pack stood up straight and started doing jumping jacks. 13 years of limping, stumbling, drooling, all fake. Wait, but every Christmas morning you'd need me. No, she'd wake me at 5 a.m. and make me soil myself before you woke up. Pack looked at me, both of us crying. I'm on 3 depression medications. Not for autism, for guilt. Knowing every day that I'm destroying your life. We stared at each other, both manipulated, both destroyed. We could have both been doctors. Instead, I'm 25 with nothing. And I'm 20 and believed I was worthless. Mom straightened up. I gave you both purpose. You gave us hell. Derek was already on the phone with the police. Pack pulled out a folder from under his chair, and that's when I knew he'd planned this. Independent living approval. I move out on December 1st. Mom tried grabbing papers from the counter, but Derek stopped her. That's evidence now. She turned to me, her face ugly with rage. You'll never forgive yourself when you realize what you've done. Pack took my hand. First time he'd touched me voluntarily in years. We already forgive ourselves. It's you we'll never forgive. As soon as the doorbell rang, Mom smoothed her hair and wiped her tears. And when the officers walked in, she said in the calmest voice, Thank God you're here. My daughter's been stealing her brother's disability money for years. I just found out today. She's been keeping him substanced so I wouldn't know. The senior officer held up his hand and the room went quiet. He looked at Mom, then at me, then at Pack, who was standing perfectly straight without any of the hunched posture I'd seen for 13 years. The officer's radio crackled and he spoke into it, requesting 2 additional units. Within minutes, 2 more officers arrived, and the senior one started directing everyone like pieces on a chessboard. One officer stayed with Pack and Derek in the living room. Another took Mom by the elbow and guided her toward the kitchen. The third officer, a woman with gray hair pulled back tight, gestured for me to follow her outside. My legs felt like water as I walked to the front porch. The cold November air hit my face and I realized I was shaking so hard my vape nearly fell from my hand. The officer noticed but didn't say anything about it, just positioned herself so we were both standing under the porch light. She pulled out a small notebook and clicked her pen. She asked me to start from the beginning of what happened tonight, and I tried to organize the chaos in my head into something that made sense. I told her about helping Pack in the bathroom, about Mom's performance at dinner, about Derek asking the innocent question that made everything explode. Through the window, I could see Pack sitting on the couch talking to his officer, his hands moving as he explained something. Derek sat next to him, nodding and adding details. Pack reached under the couch cushion and pulled out a folder, the same one I'd seen him grab earlier, and he started laying out papers on the coffee table. The officer with him leaned forward to look at the documents. I kept talking to my officer, telling her about the GoFundMe, about the burned MIT letters, about David and the baby I lost. From inside the house, I heard Mom's voice getting louder in the kitchen, that sharp edge she got when things weren't going her way. The officer with Mom was asking questions in a calm, steady voice, and Mom kept trying to redirect back to her script about me stealing and drugging Pack. But her script was falling apart because the evidence was right there in Pack's folder, in the phone I'd unlocked, in the Mifepristone bottle still sitting on the counter. I reached into my pocket and pulled out Mom's phone, the one I'd unlocked by holding it up to her face. I showed the officer the transaction history, scrolling through months of casino withdrawals. 500 here, 1,000 there, sometimes 3,000 in a single day. The total was over $100,000, all from the time period when the GoFundMe donations were coming in. The officer's pen moved faster across her notebook. Then I mentioned the pill bottle Pack had found, the Mifepristone that Mom claimed was hers. I explained what happened to my baby, how Mom said it was stress from caregiving, how I never knew she'd given me abortion medication. The officer's expression changed from neutral to something harder, more focused. She asked me to explain exactly what I meant about abortion medication, and I told her about the miscarriage, about being 19 and thinking my body had just failed me, when really mom had poisoned me to protect her scheme. The officer called into her radio for the detective unit. Inside, PAC's officer was taking photos of the documents with his phone. Derek was giving his statement, describing what he'd witnessed at dinner, confirming everything PAC said. Through the kitchen window, I could see mom pacing, her hands moving as she talked, still trying to sell her version where I was the villain. But the officer with her kept pointing at inconsistencies, kept asking questions mom couldn't answer cleanly. The officers regrouped in the hallway about 20 minutes later, conferring in voices too low for me to hear. Mom came out of the kitchen and demanded they arrest me immediately, her voice high and sharp. The senior officer held up his hand again and told everyone we were separating for the night for safety reasons. He said they needed time to investigate the allegations properly, to interview everyone separately, to review the evidence. Mom started to argue, but he cut her off, saying the decision was final. That's when Derek stepped forward and said he'd pay for a motel room for PAC and me since neither of us had money. Mom's face went red and she started screaming that Derek was part of this conspiracy, that we'd all turned against her. The senior officer told her to calm down, or he'd have to remove her from the residence. Derek pulled out his wallet and handed me 320s, then wrote down the address of a motel 2 miles away. He said he'd drive us there right now, that we shouldn't be in the house tonight. One officer told Derek he'd need to come to the station tomorrow to give a formal statement. Another told me and PAC the same thing. Mom tried to follow us out to Derek's car, but the senior officer blocked her path, saying she needed to stay at the residence. We drove to the motel in silence, Derek's hands tight on the steering wheel. The motel was the kind with exterior doors, rooms that faced the parking lot. Derek paid for 2 nights at the front desk while PAC and I stood behind him like refugees. The room had 2 double beds with faded floral bedspreads and a bathroom that smelled like bleach. Derek handed me the room key and said he'd pick us up at 8 in the morning to go to the police station. After he left, PAC and I just stood in the middle of the room, not knowing what to do with ourselves. PAC sat down on the bed nearest the door and put his head in his hands. I sat on the other bed and stared at the wall. Neither of us slept much. I kept replaying Mom's performance for the police, how smooth and confident she'd been, how she'd planned that exact response. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face when she said I'd been drugging PAC, saw the way she'd smoothed her hair and wiped her tears before the officers walked in. At 6 in the morning, I woke up from a half sleep and remembered I was supposed to work the breakfast shift at the diner in 2 hours. I called my manager and tried to explain I was having a family emergency and couldn't come in. He was annoyed because Friday morning was busy and he'd have to cover my tables himself. I knew I couldn't afford to lose this job, but I also knew I couldn't function right now. Couldn't smile at customers and refill coffee while my whole life was exploding. He said to take the day, but to be back on Saturday, or we'd need to have a conversation. Derek picked us up at 8 like he'd promised, and drove us to the police station first for our statements, then to a legal aid office on the other side of town. The office was in a rundown building with fluorescent lights that buzzed too loud. We sat in plastic chairs in the waiting area for 40 minutes before a woman came out and called our names. Her name was Alana, and she was maybe 40 with dark hair pulled back in a bun and glasses that kept sliding down her nose. She led us to a small conference room with a table and 4 chairs and a window that looked out at a parking lot. Alana listened to the whole story, her fingers flying over her laptop keyboard as she took notes. When we finished, she looked up and started talking about restraining orders and evidence preservation like this was a war we needed to win strategically. She said we needed to document everything, save every text message, every email, every receipt. She said Mom would fight back and we needed to be ready. She explained that something called Adult Protective Services would need to investigate PAC's situation, since he was supposedly a vulnerable adult under Mom's care. She said a caseworker would contact us within 48 hours to do interviews. I felt exposed and vulnerable even though we were the victims here, like we were the ones being investigated instead of Mom. Alana gave us her direct cell number and told us to call if Mom tried to contact us, or if anything else happened. 2 days later, on Sunday afternoon, a man named Clifford showed up at the motel room. He was maybe 50 with a kind face and a clipboard full of forms. He said he was the caseworker assigned to PAC's case, and he needed to interview both of us separately. He took PAC into the motel lobby for over an hour while I sat in the room trying not to panic. When they came back, PAC looked exhausted but lighter somehow, like he'd been carrying something heavy and finally put it down. Later that night after Clifford left, PAC told me he'd described every detail to the caseworker. The coaching sessions where Mom taught him how to drool and stumble. The threats about institutionalization if he ever broke character. The manufactured behaviors she made him perform in public. The way she'd wake him at 5 in the morning on Christmas to make him soil himself before I woke up. He said Clifford believed every word, took notes on everything, didn't look at him like he was crazy or lying. That evening, Alana called my cell and told me I needed to secure digital copies of everything before Mom could delete anything. I spent 3 hours forwarding myself screenshots of the GoFundMe page, the transaction history from Mom's phone, every text message I could find between Mom and relatives where she talked about PAC's care needs. I created a new email account Mom didn't know about and sent everything there, creating a paper trail that existed outside her control. Each screenshot felt like gathering ammunition for a war I never wanted to fight. The next morning, PAC knocked on my motel room door at 7, holding his phone with a weird look on his face. He sat down on the edge of the bed and pulled up his photo gallery without saying anything. The first image showed the inside of Mom's jewelry box with a pile of gray ash in one corner. He swiped to the next photo showing a closer view where you could see the remnants of burned paper and envelope fragments. He kept swiping through maybe 15 photos total, all taken from different angles with timestamps going back 3 months. He'd been documenting this since August, gathering proof while still pretending to drool and stumble around the house. The photos showed ash residue, partially burned envelope corners with my name visible, and one shot where you could make out part of David's return address before it got destroyed. I asked him why he didn't tell me sooner, and he just shook his head and said he needed to be sure first, needed to have proof that couldn't be denied. We sent copies to Elena Alana immediately, and she responded within 10 minutes saying this was exactly the kind of evidence that would prove Mom's pattern of interference and control. Monday morning, Clifford called Pac and said he'd arranged for a capacity evaluation through APS. A psychologist named Dr. Singh would come to the motel on Wednesday to do testing. Pac's hands were shaking when he hung up, and I could tell he was scared they'd find something actually wrong with him after all these years of pretending. Wednesday afternoon, Dr. Singh showed up with a briefcase full of testing materials and asked me to leave for a few hours. I walked around the strip mall next to the motel for 3 hours, going into random stores and not buying anything, just killing time and trying not to panic. When I got back, Dr. Singh was packing up and Pac looked exhausted, but also lighter somehow. Dr. Singh told us the results would go to Clifford within 48 hours, but she could tell us preliminarily that Pac showed no signs of cognitive impairment, no developmental delays, and his processing speed and reasoning were actually above average. She said whatever he'd been doing for the past 13 years, it wasn't because of any neurological condition. After she left, Pac lay down on the bed and slept for 12 hours straight. That same week, my phone started blowing up with texts from relatives I hadn't heard from in years. Aunt Linda sent a long message about how disappointed she was in me for turning on Mom after everything she'd sacrificed. Cousin Jennifer said I should be ashamed for making up lies about my disabled brother. Uncle Frank called me a vindictive little girl who couldn't handle not being the center of attention. Every message had the same tone, the same talking points, and I knew Mom was feeding them her version of events. Derek texted me Thursday morning to say Mom was sending him messages too, dozens of them, begging him to reconsider his statement to the police. She told him she'd made mistakes, but I was exaggerating everything and Pac was having a mental health crisis. She said if Derek testified against her, she'd make sure everyone knew he'd been sleeping with a woman whose disabled son was in the next room. Derek forwarded me every single text, and then sent one more saying he was blocking her number, and his statement to the police stood no matter what it cost him personally. By Friday, exactly 1 week after Thanksgiving, Alana called to say she was filing for temporary restraining orders for both Pac and me. She'd spent the week putting together a petition that laid out everything that happened at Thanksgiving: Mom's accusation to the police, the GoFundMe fraud, the coercion Pac described to Clifford, and the threatening text to extended family. She said the judge would review it and we'd have a hearing date within 2 weeks. The petition was 23 pages long, and reading through it made everything feel real in a way it hadn't before. Seeing it all typed out in legal language, numbered paragraphs describing how Mom forced Pac to soil himself on Christmas morning and intercepted my college acceptance letters, made my hands shake so bad I had to put my phone down. Monday of the second week, a detective called my cell phone directly. She introduced herself as Detective Georgia Rhodes and said the responding officers from Thanksgiving had referred the case to her for investigation of potential financial crimes. She explained that raising over $127,000 through false pretenses was serious fraud, and she was opening a case file. She needed me to come to the station to give a formal statement and bring all the documentation I'd gathered. I went in Tuesday morning with my laptop and a folder full of printed screenshots. Detective Rhodes was maybe 40 with dark hair pulled back tight, and she took notes on everything I said for almost 2 hours. She asked about the GoFundMe campaign, who set it up, what the money was supposedly for, where it actually went. She asked about Mom's gambling, and I showed her the transaction history from Mom's phone. She photographed every page of documentation and told me she'd be in touch as the investigation progressed. Detective Rhodes called me back Wednesday and said she was initiating a pharmacy subpoena. She needed to confirm who purchased the mifepristone and when, because if Mom obtained abortion medication and gave it to me without my knowledge, that was potentially criminal poisoning or assault. She said the pharmacy records would show the prescription holder, the date of purchase, and the pickup location. My hands started shaking again, just like they had when I first saw that pill bottle on Thanksgiving. The legal weight of what Mom did was becoming real in a way I hadn't fully processed yet. Rhodes said the subpoena would take about a week to process, and she'd contact me as soon as the records came back. I spent the rest of that day feeling sick to my stomach. That same week, I called the school district office and requested copies of my complete high school records. They said it would take 5 to 7 business days, and there'd be a small processing fee. The envelope arrived the following Tuesday, and I almost couldn't open it. Inside were transcripts showing straight A's through sophomore year, then a sharp drop to B's and C's junior year when I supposedly had to focus more on Pac's care. There were copies of my MIT acceptance letter dated March of my senior year, offering a full ride scholarship for engineering. Clipped to it was a note from my guidance counselor asking why I'd declined such an incredible opportunity and offering to help me reconsider. Behind that was a response on the school letterhead with my forged signature saying I needed to stay home for family caregiving obligations and wouldn't be attending college. The signature looked close to mine, but the handwriting in the body of the letter was definitely Mom's. I had to sit down on the floor and put my head between my knees because the room was spinning and I thought I might actually pass out. Thursday afternoon, Pac texted me from the grocery store saying he needed help. I drove over and found him sitting on the floor in the cereal aisle with his back against the shelves. He was breathing too fast and his face was red and people were staring. I sat down next to him and talked him through breathing exercises, counting to 4 on the inhale and 6 on the exhale until his breathing slowed down. He told me he'd been walking through the store normally, not limping or drooling, just being a regular person buying food, and suddenly he felt like everyone was watching him and judging him, and he couldn't remember how normal people were supposed to move. He said it felt like being naked in public after wearing a costume for 13 years. We sat there for maybe 20 minutes until he felt steady enough to stand up, and we left without buying anything. On the drive back to his apartment, he was quiet, and I realized that learning to be himself in public was going to take time, and probably a lot of therapy. Friday morning, Detective Rhodes called again and said she'd looped in GoFundMe's compliance team. They were flagging the campaign for fraud investigation, and would likely notify major donors that the funds were obtained through misrepresentation. She said this was standard procedure when fraud was confirmed, and the platform would probably issue refunds from their own fraud protection fund. I felt sick knowing that hundreds of people who donated money thinking they were helping my disabled brother brother, would learn they'd been scammed. Some of them were people from our church, people who'd sent $20 or $50 they probably couldn't afford. Mom had used Pac and me as props to steal from people who genuinely wanted to help, and now they'd all know the truth. That same afternoon, Derek went to the police station to give his formal statement to Detective Rhodes. He texted me afterward to say he'd described everything he witnessed at Thanksgiving dinner and observations from the months he dated Mom. He told Rhodes that Mom always had stories about Pac's care needs, but he never actually saw her doing any caregiving when he was at the house. She was always vague about where the donated money went and got defensive if he asked specific questions about Pac's medical care or therapy services. He said he'd officially ended the relationship in writing and provided Rhodes with copies of the threatening texts Mom sent him. His statement was now part of the official case file, and there was no going back from this point forward. 3 weeks crawled by, and I was starting to think maybe we'd get some peace when Alana called me at work. Mom had filed her own protective order against me and Pac, claiming I'd been drugging him to keep him dependent and stealing his disability benefits for years. The court scheduled a contested hearing where both our petition and Mom's would be heard together, and Alana's voice was tight when she told me this was going to get ugly, because Mom was fighting for her freedom now. I had to sit down in the diner's back room and put my head between my knees because the idea of standing in front of a judge while Mom accused me of the exact things she'd done made me want to throw up. That same week, Clifford showed up at Mom's house for an unannounced APS home visit. He spent 2 hours going through every room with his camera and clipboard, and when he called me afterward, he sounded almost excited. There was no adaptive equipment anywhere, no medical supplies, no specialized furniture, nothing you'd expect for someone with severe autism. He'd photographed casino promotional mailers sitting right on the kitchen counter, Players Club statements showing her tier status at 3 different casinos, and even a casino rewards calendar stuck to the fridge. Mom's story was crumbling under basic scrutiny, and Clifford said his report would document everything. Detective Rhodes moved fast on the financial investigation, serving a subpoena on Mom's bank within days of Clifford's visit. When the records came back, Rhodes called me to her office to show me the pattern. Every single GoFundMe deposit was followed within 24 to 48 hours by massive ATM withdrawals at casino locations. The spreadsheet she'd made showed over $100,000 in transactions across 2 years at 3 different casinos, with dates and amounts that lined up perfectly with the donation timeline. Rhodes told me the case was basically building itself because Mom had left such a clear paper trail, and I felt this weird mix of relief and rage that she'd been so careless with money people donated thinking they were helping my brother. Alana gave me a referral to a therapist named Lori Matsumoto, who worked at a sliding scale clinic, and I dragged myself to the first appointment, even though I didn't think talking about it would help. Lori had kind eyes and a calm voice, and within the first 20 minutes she used words I'd never heard before like parentification and complex trauma. She explained that what happened to me wasn't just about losing the MIT scholarship, it was about having my entire childhood stolen and being forced into a parent role when I was still a child myself. She said the word stolen, and something broke open in my chest, and I started crying for the first time since Thanksgiving. These ugly, choking sobs that I couldn't stop. Lori just sat there and let me cry and told me this was a completely normal response to finding out my whole life had been a lie. Meanwhile, Pac was studying for his GED test every single day, first at the motel and then at Derek's apartment after Derek offered him the spare room temporarily. I'd stop by sometimes and find him hunched over practice tests, chewing his pencil and working through math problems or essay prompts. Watching him remember how to be a student again felt like watching someone come back from the dead, his brain working the way it was supposed to after 13 years of pretending to be broken. I was proud of him and heartbroken at the same time, seeing all that wasted potential finally getting used, but knowing how much time we'd both lost. Alana started prepping us for the restraining order hearing with mock questions and answers, running through what the judge might ask and how we should respond. When we got to the part about the abortion medication, I discovered something new and terrible about myself. My vision tunneled, my hearing went fuzzy, and I couldn't remember where I was or what we were talking about. Alana stopped immediately and got me water and talked me through breathing exercises. She explained this was dissociation, my brain's way of protecting me from overwhelming trauma, and we'd need to work on grounding techniques before the actual hearing. I started practicing with Lori in therapy, learning to focus on physical sensations and present moment details when the memories got too intense. We practiced until I could say the words abortion medication out loud without completely shutting down, until the words felt less like knives cutting through me. 6 weeks after Thanksgiving, Mom showed up at the diner during my lunch shift. I was refilling coffee when I looked up and saw her standing by the hostess stand, her face set in that fake concerned expression she used to use when she wanted something. She started demanding to talk to me right there in the middle of the restaurant, her voice getting louder when I turned away. My manager came out from the back and told her to leave, and when Mom started making a scene about her daughter abandoning her disabled son, he physically walked her to the door. After she left, he pulled me aside and told me he was putting me on paid leave for a week for my safety. I knew the diner couldn't afford that, and neither could I, but he insisted and I was too shaken to argue. Alana had mentioned victim compensation, so I spent an entire day filling out the application for the state program. 20 pages of forms asking for police reports, medical records, detailed descriptions of every incident I could remember. Pac read over my shoulder and added details I'd forgotten, like the time Mom made him wet himself right before my high school graduation, so I'd have to skip the ceremony to help him. The application asked about lost wages and therapy costs and medical expenses, and Alana warned me the approval process could take months, but it might eventually cover some of what I'd lost. 2 days after I submitted the application, Detective Rhodes called me back to her office. The pharmacy records had come back and they confirmed everything. Mom had purchased mifepristone 2 days before my miscarriage, using her own insurance and picking it up at a location 3 blocks from her work. Rhodes showed me the time-stamped receipt with Mom's signature on the pickup confirmation, and there was no ambiguity left about what she'd done to me. I had to leave Rhodes's office and throw up in the bathroom bathroom, my body rejecting the truth even though my brain already knew it. Rhodes found me in the hallway afterward and told me this evidence was strong enough to support additional criminal charges, and I nodded, even though I couldn't really process what that meant. Rhodes had also tracked down David through social media, and she'd interviewed him about the dinner with Mom years ago. He'd provided screenshots of messages where Mom told him I'd said terrible things about him, that I wanted to break up but was too scared to tell him directly. The messages matched exactly with the timeline of when our relationship ended, right down to the week. Rhodes showed me the screenshots and David's written statement, and I felt this deep grief for what we could have been if Mom hadn't destroyed it. He'd loved me, and I'd loved him, and we'd been talking about getting married someday, and Mom had blown it all up because a baby would have ruined her scam. I drove home from Rhodes's office in a fog, barely remembering the route, and when I got back to the room I was renting, I just lay on the floor and stared at the ceiling for hours. The evidence kept piling up, and every new piece felt like another knife in my back. Proof of how thoroughly Mom had destroyed both our lives for casino money and whatever sick satisfaction she got from controlling us. 2 weeks later, Clifford called me to his office and handed me a thick spiral-bound report with Pac's name on the cover. I sat in the waiting area reading through 40 pages of evaluation results, psychological testing, capacity assessments, and Clifford's detailed findings that Pac showed no cognitive impairment and had been systematically coerced through threats of institutionalization. The recommendations section listed therapy referrals, independent living support services, and a note that Pac should be connected with disability rights advocates despite not actually being disabled, and I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Clifford had also recommended criminal investigation into Mom's actions, which Detective Rhodes already had going, so the pieces were lining up in ways that felt both validating and surreal. The restraining order hearing got scheduled for early January, 8 weeks after Thanksgiving, and Alana prepped me for 3 separate sessions on what to expect. The morning of the hearing, I put on the one professional outfit I owned and met Pac and Derek outside the courthouse, all of us looking nervous and exhausted. Mom showed up with an attorney who immediately started whispering strategy, and I watched her put on this wounded mother expression that made my stomach turn. The judge called the case, and we all filed into the courtroom, and Alana presented our petition first with supporting documents from Clifford, Detective Rhodes, and the pharmacy records. I testified about the fake disability, the stolen scholarship, the GoFundMe fraud, and the abortion medication, trying to keep my voice steady while Mom's attorney scribbled notes. Pac testified next and described the years of forced performance, the threats, the depression medication he took because of guilt, and his voice only cracked once when he talked about watching me give up MIT. Derek confirmed everything he witnessed at Thanksgiving, and Clifford presented his findings about Pac's competency and the coercion patterns he'd documented. Mom's attorney cross-examined me hard, bringing up that I'm in therapy and suggesting my memories might be unreliable, implying I was mentally unstable and vindictive toward my mother. Alana objected repeatedly, and the judge sustained most of them, but the accusations still felt like being stripped naked in public. The judge reviewed all the evidence for what felt like hours, then granted temporary restraining orders protecting both Pac and me for 6 months pending resolution of the criminal case. Mom's face went blank when the judge read the order, and her attorney immediately started talking about appealing, but we walked out of that courtroom with legal protection, and I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The fallout hit within days as word spread through our extended family and Mom's social circle about the hearing and the charges. My phone started getting messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in years, some of them calling me ungrateful and accusing me of destroying the family over misunderstandings. One aunt sent me a long text about how Mom sacrificed everything for us, and I was being cruel and vindictive, and I blocked her without responding. Other relatives reached out more quietly, saying they'd always thought something seemed off about the situation, but never knew what to say. A cousin I barely knew sent me a message saying she'd suspected Mom was exaggerating Pac's needs because she never actually saw him being as severe as Mom claimed, and learning she was right didn't feel as good as I thought it would. I'd imagined that public vindication would feel triumphant, but instead it just felt exhausting and sad, like everyone was picking sides in a war nobody should have had to fight. Alana filed a civil lawsuit against Mom in mid-December for fraud, conversion, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, seeking the full $127,000 plus additional damages. We met in her office to go over the complaint before filing, and she was careful to set my expectations low about actually collecting any money. She explained that even if we won a judgment, which seemed likely given the evidence, collecting from someone who gambled everything away was nearly impossible. Mom had no assets, no significant income, and bankruptcy could potentially discharge some of the debt, but Alana said having the judgment on record mattered for other reasons, like preventing Mom from profiting off the story or inheriting money without us having a claim. December 1st arrived, exactly 1 week after Pac's 21st birthday, and I helped him move into an approved independent living apartment that APS had arranged. The place was tiny, just a studio with a bathroom and kitchenette, but it was his own space for the first time ever. A charity that helps abuse survivors had donated furniture, so there was a bed, a small couch, a table with 2 chairs, and basic kitchen supplies, all mismatched but functional. Pac stood in the middle of the empty apartment before we started unloading boxes, just looking around with this expression I couldn't quite read. We spent the afternoon arranging his few belongings, hanging up clothes in the closet, organizing the donated dishes in the cabinets, and setting up his laptop on the table. When everything was in place, Pac sat on the couch and started crying, and I sat next to him and cried too, both of us overwhelmed by the weight of what this tiny apartment represented. I slept on Pac's floor that first night because neither of us could handle being alone yet, and we stayed up late talking about what we wanted to do with our lives, now that we could actually make our own choices. The second night I was there again, and the third, and by the end of the week we'd fallen into this routine of me showing up after work with takeout and sleeping in a sleeping bag on his floor. After 7 days, Pac gently told me I needed to find my own place because we both needed to learn how to be separate people, and I knew he was right. right, even though it hurt to hear. We'd spent so many years with our lives tangled together in this sick way that learning to be siblings instead of caregiver and dependent felt like learning to walk again. Pac took his GED in mid-December at a testing center across town, and I waited in the parking lot the whole 4 hours because he'd asked me to be there when he came out. When he walked out of the building, I couldn't read his expression, and then he said he thought he'd done okay but wasn't sure. The results came back a week later showing he'd scored in the 90th percentile across all subjects, and he called me crying so hard I could barely understand him. He told me it was the first thing he'd ever accomplished that was actually his, not part of Mom's performance, and I told him I was so proud I could burst. He framed the certificate and hung it on his apartment wall right next to the door, and every time I visited, I saw him glance at it like he was reminding himself it was real. I spent an entire evening in late December writing an email to MIT's admissions office, trying to explain my situation without sounding like I was making excuses or asking for special treatment. I attached documentation from Detective Rhodes, Clifford's APS report, Lori's letter about the abuse, and my high school transcripts showing the straight A's I'd had before sophomore year. The transfer coordinator responded 3 days later saying that while they couldn't undo what happened, there were pathways for non-traditional students to be considered. If I completed a year of community college with strong grades, they'd consider my application again, and it wasn't a guarantee, but it was a door that wasn't completely closed. I read that email 5 times, and each time the words felt a little more real, a little more like actual possibility instead of impossible fantasy. Detective Rhodes arrested Mom in late December on charges of wire fraud and theft by deception related to the GoFundMe campaign. Rhodes called me right after to let me know, and I pulled up the county jail website to see the booking photo. Mom had bonded out within 24 hours using money from somewhere, probably a relative who still believed her version of events, and in her mugshot she looked defiant rather than ashamed. Her face had this set expression like she was the victim in all this, and seeing that look made me feel sick and angry at the same time. Mom's criminal defense attorney filed motions in early January attacking my mental health history and credibility, bringing up that I was in therapy and suggesting I might be fabricating memories or exaggerating events. The motion cited my emotional state, my history of caregiving stress, and implied I was an unreliable witness who'd built this narrative to justify abandoning my disabled brother. Alana called me as soon as she got the filing and warned me this was standard defense strategy, but reading those words about myself in a legal document felt like being violated all over again. I had a session with Lori that same day, and we worked through the triggering effect of having my trauma weaponized against me, practicing grounding techniques and reminding myself that defense attorneys attack credibility when they can't attack facts. Lori pulled out a worksheet and explained how trauma rewires the brain's response patterns. She showed me diagrams of the nervous system and pointed to where my body was storing stress from 16 years of caregiving. We practiced a grounding technique where I had to name 5 things I could see, 4 I could touch, 3 I could hear, 2 I could smell, and 1 I could taste. It felt stupid at first, but when I tried it during a panic attack in the grocery store 2 days later, my heart rate actually slowed down. She gave me homework about identifying my triggers and writing down 3 boundaries I needed to set with people in my life. I spent an hour that night staring at a blank page before I could write anything down. The first boundary I wrote was that I wouldn't answer questions about Mom from people who hadn't been there. The second was that I could leave any situation where I felt unsafe without explaining myself. The third took me another hour to figure out, and finally I wrote that I didn't owe anyone my forgiveness timeline. Lori reviewed my homework the next week and added notes about how to enforce these boundaries when people pushed back, because they would push back. She taught me phrases like, "I'm not discussing that," and "I need to end this conversation now," and we role-played scenarios until I could say them without my voice shaking. The toolkit she mentioned wasn't about fixing everything. It was about having actual tools to use when things got bad, and slowly I started to feel less like I was drowning and more like I was treading water. Derek called me in mid-January to tell me the school board had placed him on administrative leave. His voice was tight and I could hear him pacing while he talked. The board had learned he was involved in a criminal case against a parent, even though he kept explaining he was a witness and not a defendant. They cited policy about staff conduct and community trust, and a bunch of other bureaucratic reasons that basically meant they wanted distance from the situation. He told me the leave was paid pending their investigation, which would take at least 6 weeks, maybe longer. I asked if he regretted getting involved, and there was a long pause before he answered. He said he'd make the same choice again because staying silent would have made him complicit in what Mom did to us. He said some things are more important than job security, and he could live with losing his position, but he couldn't live with knowing he'd witnessed abuse and done nothing. I told him I respected that, even though I still couldn't quite forgive him for dating Mom in the first place. He said he understood, and he wasn't asking for forgiveness, just letting me know what was happening. We hung up, and I sat there thinking about how many people had seen pieces of what was wrong over the years, but nobody had connected the dots until Derek asked that one question at Thanksgiving. Christmas came and went without any contact from Mom, which felt both like relief and like waiting for a bomb to drop. Pac and I decided to skip all the traditional holiday stuff and just do our own thing for New Year's. We ordered 2 large pizzas to his apartment, 1 pepperoni and 1 with extra cheese, and we set up his laptop to stream movies we'd both wanted to see but never had time for. We watched 3 movies back to back, taking breaks to eat cold pizza and drink soda, and neither of us mentioned Mom or the court cases or any of the heavy stuff hanging over us. At 11:30, Pac got up and walked to his closet without saying anything. He came back carrying a garbage bag and started pulling out all the reminders of the fake disability that Mom had made him keep. Adult diapers still in their packages, adaptive utensils he'd never actually needed, a special cushion for his wheelchair that had always been for show. I helped him stuff everything into the bag, and we added the limb braces Mom had ordered from medical supply catalogs, and the communication cards she'd printed out that Pac had never used. At midnight, we heard fireworks outside, and we took the bag down to the dumpster behind his building. Pac lifted the bag over his head and threw it in with both hands, and the sound it made hitting the bottom felt final. We stood there in the cold for a minute, and Pac said this was his real new year, the one where he got to be himself. I told him it was mine too, the one where I wasn't just a caregiver anymore. We went back inside and finished the last of the pizza, and I slept on his couch, and for the first time in months, I didn't have nightmares. The first week of January, Pac had an appointment with a community college advisor to talk about enrollment. I drove him there and waited in the lobby while they met for over an hour. When he came out, he was holding a folder full of papers, and he looked nervous but also excited in a way I hadn't seen before. The advisor had mapped out a plan for him to start computer science classes in the spring semester, beginning with intro courses and math fundamentals. Pac was worried about being in classes with people his age after missing so much school, and the advisor had connected him with disability services. The irony wasn't lost on either of us, that he'd get accommodations for his actual mental health issues, the depression and anxiety from years of abuse, after spending so long faking a disability he didn't have. The accommodations would let him take tests in a quiet room and get extensions if he had panic attacks, and he'd have access to counseling through the campus health center. We stopped at a coffee shop on the way home, and Pac spread all the papers out on the table, showing me the course catalog and the degree requirements and the timeline the advisor had created. He said he wanted to study cybersecurity eventually, something about protecting systems and finding vulnerabilities, and I thought about how fitting that was for someone who'd spent years finding ways to survive in a broken system. He filled out the enrollment forms right there in the coffee shop, and I took a picture of him signing his name because it felt like documenting something important. Alana called in late January to update me on the civil case. The court had compelled Mom to produce a full financial accounting of all the GoFundMe funds, every deposit, and every withdrawal, with documentation. Mom's attorney had immediately filed objections and delay motions, claiming the request was overly broad and burdensome. Alana said this was completely expected, and we were looking at months of back and forth, maybe over a year before we'd see any actual accounting. She told me I needed to accept that the civil case wasn't really about getting money back. It was about establishing truth on the record. Even if we won a judgment for the full amount, Mom had no assets and no way to pay, so we'd be lucky to see $50 a month in restitution for the rest of our lives. The real goal was having a court document that said officially what Mom had done, something that couldn't be disputed or spun into her victim narrative. I asked what happened if Mom just refused to comply, and Alana said the judge could hold her in contempt, but that was another whole process with its own delays. She reminded me that justice doesn't look like it does on TV. It's slow and frustrating and often unsatisfying, but we were building a paper trail that would follow Mom forever. I hung up feeling deflated, but also grateful that Alana kept setting realistic expectations instead of promising things she couldn't deliver. Detective Rhodes called me in early February with an update about the casino records. Compliance officers from 3 different casinos had responded to her subpoena with detailed records of Mom's gambling. Her player loyalty card showed losses totaling $103,000 across 18 months, with dates and times and even which specific slot machines she'd played. The records included cocktail comps she'd received, showing she'd been drinking while gambling away money people had donated for Pac's care. Rhodes walked me through some of the details over the phone, and the pattern was clear as day. Money would hit Mom's bank account from GoFundMe, and within 48 hours there would be massive ATM withdrawals at casino locations. Some nights she'd lost $5,000 in 3 hours, just feeding bills into machines over and over. Rhodes said the records painted a picture of someone with a serious gambling addiction who'd found a way to fund it by using her children as a renewable resource. She said the prosecution was using these records as evidence of intent and planning, showing this wasn't just a one-time mistake, but a sustained pattern of fraud. I asked if this meant Mom would definitely go to jail, and Rhodes said she couldn't promise anything, but the evidence was strong enough that Mom's attorney would probably push for a plea deal to avoid trial. She said to prepare for that possibility, and to think about what kind of plea I could live with, because the prosecutor would want my input before accepting any deal. An aunt I barely remembered, Mom's older sister who'd moved to Arizona years ago, sent me a Facebook message in mid-February. The message was long and full of phrases about family bonds and Christian forgiveness, and how I needed to make peace with Mom because blood is thicker than water. She said Mom was suffering and alone, and that I was being cruel by refusing contact. She said families work through problems together, and that cutting Mom off completely was extreme and vindictive. I read the message 3 times and started typing a response about how this aunt hadn't been around for any of the 16 years I'd spent as Pac's caregiver. I wrote about the MIT scholarship and the abortion medication and the $103,000 gambled away. I deleted it and wrote a shorter version just explaining that Mom had committed fraud and abuse. I deleted that too and wrote an even shorter version saying I appreciated her concern, but this wasn't her business. I deleted that one as well and finally just blocked her without responding at all. I brought it up with Lori in my next session, and she told me that choosing no contact with people who enable abuse is a valid boundary. She said I didn't owe anyone access to me just because we shared DNA, and that people who hadn't lived through the situation didn't get to judge my choices about it. She reminded me that forgiveness isn't something anyone can demand, and it's not required for me to heal. I left that session feeling lighter, like I'd been given permission to protect myself without guilt. Detective Rhodes contacted David in late February to get his formal statement about Mom's interference in our relationship. He provided a notarized statement describing the dinner he'd had with Mom years ago, and the messages she'd sent him afterward. He also sent me a personal email letting me know he'd cooperated with the investigation. The email was kind and careful, and he mentioned that he was engaged now and happy with someone he'd met at work. There was no anger in his message, just sadness about what Mom had taken from both of us, the relationship we might have had, and the baby we'd lost. He said he hoped I was doing okay, and that he was glad the truth had finally come out. I sat with that email for 2 days before I could bring myself to respond. I wrote back congratulating him and saying I was genuinely glad he'd found someone and built a good life. I meant it, even though reading about his engagement made my chest hurt. I told him thank you for helping with the case and for being willing to dredge up painful memories. We exchanged a few more messages over the next last week, catching up on the basics of our lives, and then we both seemed to understand that this was closure, not reconnection. Some doors close for good, and trying to force them open just damages what was there before. I visited Pac's apartment on a Saturday in late February, and we were sitting on his couch talking about his classes when he suddenly turned and hugged me. It was the first voluntary physical contact he'd offered in years, not counting holding hands that one time at Thanksgiving. His arms were stiff at first, like he wasn't sure how to do it, and then he relaxed and held on for a few seconds before pulling back. He immediately asked if that was okay, and if I needed space, his face worried like he'd done something wrong. I realized we were both learning how to calibrate normal sibling affection after years of our relationship being defined by fake caregiving, where every touch had been about performing disability or providing care. I told him the hug was perfect, and that he didn't need to ask permission for normal sibling stuff. We talked about it for a while, about how neither of us really knew what a healthy sibling relationship looked like because ours had been so twisted from the start. He said he was working on it in therapy, learning the difference between dependence and connection, and I told him I was doing the same work. We decided we'd figure it out together, making up our own rules as we went, and if we messed up, we'd just talk about it and try again. Clifford called me in early March to let me know that APS was officially closing the immediate risk case. Pac was stable in his independent living situation, connected to therapy and support services, and no longer in need of protective intervention. Clifford had set up an ongoing service plan with check-ins every 3 months, and continued therapy through the county mental health system. He said the structure would stay in place as a safety net, even though Pac didn't technically need protective services anymore. Clifford told me he'd been doing this work for 15 years, and he'd never seen a case quite like ours, where someone had faked a disability for so long under coercion. He said he was glad we'd both gotten out and that he'd be available if we ever needed help navigating systems in the future. I thanked him for believing Pac when he told his story, and for moving quickly to get him safe. After we hung up, I called Pac to tell him the news, and he was quiet for a minute before he said it felt like an official end to that chapter. I told him it was more like the end of the prologue, that we were just starting the actual story of our lives now, the one where we got to make our own choices. He laughed and said that was a better way to think about it, and then he told me about a programming assignment he was working on for class. And I listened to him talk about code and algorithms, and I thought about how far we'd both come in just 4 months. The preliminary hearing happened in March at the county courthouse downtown, and I sat in the gallery behind the prosecutor's table watching Mom sit stone-faced at the defense table. The prosecutor laid out the fraud scheme piece by piece, showing bank records with GoFundMe deposits followed immediately by casino withdrawals, showing the fake disability documentation Mom had created, showing screenshots of her Players Club rewards totaling over $100,000 in losses. Mom stared straight ahead the entire time, her face blank like she was watching a boring movie instead of her own criminal case. The judge reviewed the evidence folder for what felt like forever, before announcing there was sufficient probable cause to bind the case over for trial. Then the judge looked directly at everyone in the courtroom and warned us to stay off social media and avoid any public commentary about the case. I wanted to laugh because half our community already knew the basic story from gossip and leaked details. Walking out of the courthouse afterward, I felt this weird mix of relief that the case was moving forward and dread about how long this was all going to take. Alana caught up with me in the parking lot and reminded me this was just the beginning of the criminal process. That trial could be 6 months away or more. I started part-time classes at community college in April, enrolling in English composition and introduction to psychology to ease back into academic work. The coffee shop hired me for evening shifts after the diner situation fell apart, and my new schedule meant I was constantly exhausted. I'd wake up at 6 a.m. to study before my 9 a.m. class, then work from 5 p.m. to closing at 10 p.m., then study again until midnight. My body felt like it was running on fumes most days, moving between school and work and therapy appointments and court dates in this endless loop. But I was also moving forward for the first time in 16 years, taking classes that were actually mine, earning money that wasn't tied to Mom's schemes. That had to count for something even when I was so tired I could barely see straight. Pac's grand jury testimony happened in late April, and he was terrified for days leading up to it. He called me the night before asking if he could do this, if he was strong enough to sit in front of strangers and describe 13 years of fake disability performance. I told him he was the bravest person I knew, and that telling the truth mattered more than anything else right now. The testimony itself took 3 hours according to what the prosecutor told us later, with Pac describing every detail of the coaching, the threats about institutionalization, the manufactured behaviors Mom forced him to perform. When he came out of the grand jury room, he looked completely drained, like someone had pulled all the energy out of his body. That night he slept for 12 hours straight without waking up once. When he finally woke up the next afternoon, he texted me saying he felt like he'd finally told the truth in a way that mattered, in a way that would be part of the official record forever. I texted back telling him he was the bravest person I knew, and I meant every word. Mom violated the restraining order in late April by leaving a handwritten letter on my doorstep at the room I was renting. I found it when I came home from my morning class, this white envelope with my name written in Mom's handwriting sitting right there on the welcome mat. My hands shook as I picked it up and read through the pages inside. The letter was full of guilt tripping about how I was destroying the family and veiled threats about what would happen if I kept cooperating with the investigation. I didn't touch the letter with my bare hands after the first read, instead using a paper towel to handle it while I photographed every page. Then I called the police non-emergency line and reported the violation immediately, sending the photos to the detective handling the restraining order enforcement. Mom got a warning and a minor sanction, basically a note in her file and a stern talking to from a judge. I was furious that the consequences were so light for such a clear violation. Alana explained we were building a pattern of documentation, that each violation added to the record even if individual consequences seemed small. Civil deposition prep happened in May at Alana's office, and she sat me down to reset my expectations in a way that felt brutal but necessary. She explained that even if we won a judgment for the full $127,000 amount, Mom had no assets left to collect from. The restitution would likely be a token amount like $50 per month that would take decades to pay off the full judgment. The real goal wasn't financial recovery. It was safety and closure, and having the truth established on the legal record. I needed to grieve the money I was never going to get back instead of holding on to hope that someday I'd see those funds returned. Hearing Alana say it so directly made something crack inside my chest. This painful acceptance that the money was gone forever no matter what the courts decided. Pac and I drove out to a park we used to go to as little kids one Saturday in May, before everything got twisted and wrong. We sat on the swings talking about what family actually means now that we've seen how badly blood relations can hurt you. The swings creaked as we rocked back and forth, and I remembered being 7 years old here thinking Mom and Pac were my whole world. We decided that family isn't about shared blood or obligation or guilt. It's about people who see you as fully human and want your good without expecting you to perform or sacrifice yourself. By that definition, we were each other's family, and Mom never was. And there was grief in that realization, but also freedom. Derek accepted an official reprimand at his teaching job and returned to work in May after being on leave since January. The school board decided he'd acted appropriately as a witness, but still needed formal discipline for the appearance of involvement. He'd testify when called during the criminal trial, but otherwise he was maintaining appropriate distance from Pac and me. He sent occasional check-in texts making sure we were okay, but he wasn't trying to be a savior or stay tangled up in our lives beyond what the legal case required. I appreciated that boundary, that he understood we needed space to rebuild without him playing hero. A short article ran in the local paper in June about a woman charged with fraud involving a fake disability claim and misuse of charitable donations. The article didn't name Pac or me since we were victims, but it named Mom and included enough details that anyone in our community could figure out who it was about. The online comments were a mix of support and victim blaming, with some people expressing outrage at what Mom did, and others questioning why we didn't figure it out sooner. Lori helped me make the decision to completely disengage from reading anything about the case online. She explained that consuming that commentary was just re-traumatizing myself over and over, and I needed to focus on my own healing instead of trying to control what strangers thought. Pac landed a part-time job at the community college IT help desk in June, working 15 hours a week helping students and faculty with basic computer problems. His first paycheck was $340 after taxes, and he was so excited he took a picture of it before depositing it at the bank. He told me it was the first money he'd ever earned that was actually his, not part of Mom's performance or tied to her schemes in any way. Watching him discover pride in his own work and capability was one of the best things to come out of this whole nightmare. He framed the pay stub and hung it on his apartment wall next to his GED certificate. Mom accepted a plea deal in late June to reduce charges, avoiding trial in exchange for pleading guilty to theft by deception. She got 3 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and a restitution order for the full $127,000 that she'd probably never actually pay. It wasn't the justice I wanted, not even close to what felt fair for 16 years of stolen life. But Detective Rhodes explained that probation meant any violation would send Mom straight to jail, so there were some real teeth in the sentence even if it felt light. The plea deal meant no trial, which also meant Pac and I wouldn't have to testify in open court and face cross-examination from Mom's attorney. That part felt like a relief, even though the overall outcome left me angry and unsatisfied. The civil case wrapped up the last week of June with a consent judgment where Mom admitted liability for the full $127,000 plus interest. Alana called me into her office to sign the final paperwork, and I watched her highlight the important sections with a yellow marker while explaining what it all meant. The judgment was entered into the court record as a permanent debt that Mom owed, but Alana was clear that actually collecting the money was a different story entirely. She pulled up Mom's financial disclosure on her laptop and showed me the checking account with $340 in it. No assets, no property, no income beyond occasional cash work that she probably wasn't reporting. The judgment meant that if Mom ever inherited money or got a real job or won the lottery, we could go after those funds, but right now there was nothing to collect. Alana explained that the real value was that Mom couldn't discharge this debt in bankruptcy because it was based on fraud, so it would follow her forever as a permanent mark on her credit and her record. I signed the judgment papers feeling hollow because $127,000 was still gone, and probably always would be, but at least there was something official saying Mom owed it. The final protective order hearing happened the first week of July, and the judge granted a 2-year order keeping Mom away from both Pac and me. The judge read through the violation reports from April when Mom left the letter on my doorstep, and he made it very clear that any contact, direct or indirect, would result in immediate arrest and criminal charges. He looked directly at Mom's attorney and said that indirect contact included having other people reach out on her behalf, posting about us on social media, or showing up anywhere she knew we'd be. The order covered our homes, workplaces, schools, and required Mom to stay at least 500 feet away from us at all times. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt like I could breathe properly for the first time since Thanksgiving, even though I knew 2 years wasn't forever, and eventually the order would expire. I met with my community college advisor in mid-July to map out a transfer plan to MIT. The advisor pulled up my spring semester grades showing a 3.9 GPA and asked about my long-term goals, and I explained the whole situation about the destroyed scholarship and the 16 years of caregiving. She took notes and created a milestone timeline on her whiteboard, showing that I needed to complete a full year with a 4.0, retake the SAT to get my scores current, and submit a transfer application with supporting documentation about the educational disruption. I asked Lori to write a letter documenting how the disruption was caused by abuse and fraud rather than my academic capability, and she agreed immediately and said she'd include details about the parentification and complex trauma diagnosis. The advisor was honest that MIT transfers were extremely competitive and there were no guarantees, but she also said my story was unique and the documentation would help explain the gap in my academic record. record. I left her office with a printed timeline and a plan that felt like a long shot, but also like a real shot, and that was more than I'd had in years. Pac texted me in late July asking if I wanted to come over for dinner, just the two of us, to mark our own personal new year. I showed up at his apartment with ingredients from the grocery store, actual fresh food that wasn't expired or donated, and we cooked together in his tiny kitchen. He made pasta while I put together a salad, and we moved around each other carefully like we were still learning how to be normal siblings instead of caregiver and patient. We sat at his small table eating slowly and talking about our goals for the next year, and there was grief woven through everything because we were mourning the lives we should have had. But there was also genuine contentment in the moment. Pac talked about his computer science classes starting in fall, and his hope to eventually transfer to a 4-year school, and I talked about the MIT plan and my therapy progress. We didn't try to fix anything or make big declarations, we just ate our meal and acknowledged that we were both still here and still trying, and that felt like enough. By early August, I could give a clear status update on everything when people asked. The criminal case was resolved with Mom on probation for 3 years. The civil judgment was entered but uncollectible. The protective order was active for 2 years. I was enrolled full-time at community college for fall with a 3.0. 9 GPA from spring. Pac was working at the IT help desk and taking classes. We were both in therapy twice a month and we were both housed safely. It wasn't triumph and it wasn't vindication. It was just survival that was starting to look like stability. I'd stopped expecting some dramatic moment of justice or closure and started accepting that this was what recovery looked like. Small concrete steps forward with the weight of the past still there, but not crushing me anymore. I moved into a rented room in a house with 2 other community college students in August, paying $450 a month plus utilities. The room was small with just enough space for a twin bed, a desk, and a narrow closet, but it was mine and I could lock the door. I set up practical boundaries and routines immediately, installing my own deadbolt lock, keeping my important documents in a fireproof box under my bed, and maintaining a separate bank account that Mom had never known about. I wrote out a list of safety rules and taped it to my wall. Things like never sharing my address publicly, checking that doors and windows were locked before sleeping, and having Pac's number on speed dial. I was learning that safety wasn't something anyone just gave you. It was something you built in small concrete steps, one boundary and one routine at a time. An email arrived from MIT in mid-August with the subject line, Transfer Pathway Information Session. My hands were shaking as I opened it and read that they'd received my inquiry and wanted to provide information about the process for non-traditional transfer students. There were no promises in the email, no guarantees or special consideration mentioned, just an acknowledgement that my situation had been noted, and an invitation to a virtual information session the following week. I signed up for the session immediately, and then sat staring at the confirmation email, feeling something that wasn't quite hope but wasn't despair either. It was an opening, a door that wasn't completely closed, and that was more than I'd had on Thanksgiving when I thought my entire future had been decided for me. Pac sent me a photo in late August of his apartment wall where he'd hung his framed GED certificate next to his first paycheck stub. His fall class schedule was posted on his refrigerator with the courses highlighted in different colors, and when I visited, he told me his therapy sessions were helping him separate his identity from the performance he'd maintained for 13 years. He was learning that he wasn't worthless or broken. He was someone who'd survived something impossible and come out the other side still capable of growth and change. Watching him build self-respect from scratch was teaching me how to do the same thing, how to see myself as someone who'd been victimized but wasn't defined by that victimization. On a quiet evening in late August, I fell asleep in my rented room without listening for sounds of Pac needing help, without wondering if Mom was going to show up, without the weight of caregiving crushing my chest. I'd blocked Mom on everything, committed to no contact permanently, and was slowly rebuilding a life that was actually mine. The peace I felt wasn't perfect or complete. There was still anger and grief and fear woven through everything, but it was real peace that I'd earned through concrete actions and hard boundaries. I was learning that sometimes survival with scars is the victory, that you don't have to be healed or whole or triumphant to be okay. You just have to keep moving forward one small step at a time. That's the whole thing. Nothing polished, just me telling it how I saw it. Thanks for keeping me company for a few minutes. We'll do it again sometime.